Question is, the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Wright.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, Deputy Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to stand and address and give my comments to the Road Safety Remuneration Repeal Bill 2016 in its form as a cognitive debate. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the owner-operators in the gallery and thank you very much for your commitment. It gives great weight to the House to have you in the chamber to witness firsthand the frustrations of the machinations of this House, and gives you the opportunity to see the quality of debate from both sides of the House and how disconnected it can be from the reality of the issue that presents itself before you. Mr Speaker, can I say that in picking up the comments from one of the previous speakers in the House, a speaker who I have regard for, the member for Moreton, who when he said that there was next to none or no experience in the House. Well, this year, Mr Speaker, I celebrate my 24th year in the transport industry. I employ 10 owner-operators and 10 drivers around the state, and my wife runs that business successfully today. My brother's in the industry. My grandfather before us was in the industry, who had the sole contract on the railway yards at Rockhampton. In addition, he had a furniture removal business. And if you're ever in Toowoomba, take the opportunity to duck into the Toowoomba Heritage Village there, where you'll find a Cobb & Co style horse-drawn carriage labelled Buchholz Transport. So transport is in our family's blood. Transport is still a vehicle that allows me the privilege of standing and defending an industry which I think has been harshly dealt with. The bill that I tend to speak on today, I believe, not only disrupts the industry, but it's disgraceful in its intent, where it discriminates against a group of owner-drivers in the way that the bill has been prepared. At every step of this bill since coming to the House in 2012, I have spoken against it, because I inherently saw the damage that it would do to a market and the ramifications that that would have to owner-drivers, their families, and a sector. And without owner-drivers in that particular sector, taking that competition out of the market, Australians would be worse off in having the larger companies slowly ratchet up their prices. But don't take my word for it. Do not take my word for it. In the last 48 hours, we have seen over 200 protest drivers here in Canberra making their point. This morning, another 40 drivers, and 40 being the number because it was limited by the Australian Transport Association, which held a function here in Canberra. And a small well, when I went down to the showgrounds this morning to get into a truck, lo and behold, it was an operator that was delivering product on a nightly basis into one of my Toowoomba depots 15 years ago, and it was great to catch up with him. And I thank Tony Curtis for the work that he has done in leaving his family, coming down here. He was in two minds as to whether or not he would travel, but he was happy that he had made the journey because he knows that he's making a contribution to the national debate. In addition to the conversations that are happening here in Canberra on the national debate, the state of Queensland is also alive with owner-operators voicing their concern. And I know it's happening all around Australia. We've seen rallies conducted right around this great country of ours. In my electorate alone, Keith Davies has contacted our office. And I'm just going to give a quick overview of the style of commentary that they have given, so that for the benefit of Hansard, you'll get an idea of the flavour of what the owner-drivers think of this piece of legislation. Keith Davies, get rid of it. Anthony Dodds, why? Paul Spring, how can this happen? Luke Rickers, it must go. Glenn Smith, I'm worried. Ken Wilkie, I'm gone. Bob Ward, Paula Lee, Jeff Silcott, this is a joke. Warren Ahern, you've got to do something about it, Scotty. Dennis Peter Fisher, Wayne Schultz, Siobhan Banner, Steve Greer, this is crazy legislation. Steve Smith has contacted my office on over 10 occasions, and dozens more. And Hansard would not, Mr Speaker, allow me to repeat some of the colourful commentary that has been delivered by such enthusiastic representatives of the owner-driver industry. But why are they so upset? Why would an industry explode virtually overnight? Because they know that as a result of this terrible piece of legislation, which was to come in effect as of the 1st of April as an order by the tribunal, that it was going to be unworkable and would price a particular sector out of the market. The government gave evidence at that tribunal and tried, in its capacity as being able to give evidence, to push the remuneration start date back out to the 1st of April of next year. The tribunal, where you've heard commentary today about we should enter into a more conciliatory and conversational dialogue with the tribunal. Well, Mr. Speaker, let me assure you that that dialogue has happened. And the dialogue from the owner-operators, from the peak industries, has fallen on deaf ears. We heard one of the crossbencher speakers who come in here before, who previously supported the application, talk about a heightened level of arrogance from the tribunal that had forced him, with that arrogance, to change his position, and he is now supporting the industry. In addition to that, the online rate remuneration calculator was only published not 28 days beforehand, and it was on the back of that as government we made the decision that we would push this start date back out. As the energy in and around this movement become greater and greater and greater, we could not support anything other than abolishing this tribunal. And so the Prime Minister, Senator Cash from Western Australia, who, can I say, has done an outstanding job leading the charge, and I want to acknowledge the Prime Minister for his nimbleness, for his agility, to be able to see this problem, address it and nip it in the bud. The sector, Mr. Speaker, I can assure you, is terrified. They are worried about the financial pressures that this bill will bring on top of their businesses. How are they going to make their truck payments? I know drivers now are already touching base with their banks, looking for extensions on payments and being knocked back. And that truck is often also the first and only source of revenue for a household where mortgage payments are linked to, school fees are linked to. So this bill doesn't save lives. It destroys lives, Mr. Speaker. It destroys lives and it destroys businesses in our economy, and that's what motivates me to stand here and speak against the bill. One of the downsides of this bill is when the remuneration calculator is to be used, it only affects owner drivers. So when you've got two sectors of the market, company drivers and owner drivers are forced to quote an inflated rate, and even if you look at the minutiae of how a rate would be calculated, historically an owner driver would quote to a potential client a kilometre rate on a long haul trip. The deal would be done and away you would go. Under the current rate remuneration tribunal online calculator, effectively you are unable to give a quote until you get home. And so that doesn't work for small business. The variables that have been imposed in the market are unworkable, and it is those very points that have generated a level of enthusiasm in the sector for them to rise up and say that this is unfair. And it is unfair, because it doesn't allow the market forces to play out in its own right. When you've got a compulsion of the owner drivers having to quote an inflated rate, but yet the rest of the market can quote a rate at much lower prices, you can only make the assumption and support the cynic's point of view that the legislation was designed for no other reason but to drive the owner-operators out of the market. And that is not good for Australian business, it is not good for our nation, it's not good for our country. How can you say on the other side that you're supporting the sector by introducing a fair rates tribunal when all this tribunal is doing is sending them broke? Effectively, yes, you will save lives because there'll be no owner-operators left on the road. This single policy is up there with some of the worst policy positions that we've seen from those on the other side of the House, Mr. Speaker. We've seen the mining tax that raised no money. We saw the installation programs that burnt many hundreds of homes to the ground. We saw the effect that policy on that side of the House had on the live cattle export ban. Devastating, hundreds and hundreds of small businesses. And we saw the policy position of those on the other side when we saw over 50,000 legal immigrants come to this country through our shores. I've had no one, not one person, reach out to my office, either in the electorate of Bow Desert nor here in Canberra, ring me up from the sector and say the Safe Rates Remuneration Tribunal must stay, that it is wonderful for the industry. Not one. Not one. Too many drivers are now parked up, not earning a brass razoo, uncertain what their financial security looks like. That is why, Mr Speaker, there must be an element of urgency around eliminating this tribunal. You should also consider, I encourage the government when considering getting rid of this, that it doesn't only just affect the owner-drivers, but there is a flow-on sector that goes with it. You've got your mechanical services, and I speak no other of Rod Smith, Smith Mechanical from Peak Crossing. I had the opportunity to catch up with him the other day, and he suggested that if this piece of legislation came into effect, or this tribunal was not to be abolished, that he would lose up to 30% of his business as an unintended consequence of owner-drivers being forced off the road. That would eliminate, that would result in him having to put off workers in a local area where he's potentially the largest mechanic workshop in the district. And no one should stand in this place and put their hand on the heart and say that that's good for our country. Mr Speaker, I will vote to abolish this bill, and I will keep fighting for our owner-drivers because transport is in my blood. I want to acknowledge the crossbenchers, and in particular the bravery that was shown by those crossbenchers in this House who initially supported the bill, for them to have seen a light at the other end of the tunnel, for those to have seen the failings in this, whilst there may have been some intention, or the honourable members on those other side of the House had good intention. The execution of this tribunal has led potentially to the death knell of a sector who deserves to be treated better, who deserves the economic freedom to be able to operate on our roads legally and profitably. I want to acknowledge, and I will condemn those from the crossbenchers who don't support, who make the conscious decision that owner-operators should be forced off the road because they have a role to play in our economy. I want to acknowledge the crossbenchers in the Senate who made the journey down to the front lawns this morning, who, again, in some circumstances, supported this bill in previous measures, and offer them my thanks for them changing their position to bring this terrible bill to its finality. Unfortunately, this bill in its current stature destroys lives. And if I can finish up, Mr Speaker, by saying there is work that needs to be done in safe rates in this industry. I will work with the industry to try and find what those nuances look like into the future. But in order to give them some breathing space, in order to give the industry the opportunity not to have over 20,000 second-hand trucks pushed back onto the market, not to have homes, banks screaming at homeowners being forced out of their homes and repossessed as a result of their only source of revenue being taken from them, that enthuses me to walk into this place every day. And while I have breath in my body, I will fight for this sector. I believe in it. It has been very good to me. It has been very good to my family over many generations. And I know that the people who operate in this sector are decent people and deserve the right to be heard. And I commend this bill to the House.